in community with you all that we have had at the Cross Cultural Center. So welcome today, and let's go ahead and get started.
So hi everyone, my name is Beatriz Barron. My gender pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm the Operations and Events Coordinator here at the Cross Cultural Center. I do want to preface by saying that the closed captioning will only capture my voice because we're using Google Slides, and for some odd reason on Dells or PCs, it only picks up the person that is sharing the screen. However, we will be uploading this video on YouTube and there'll be full closed captioning available there.
Hello again, everyone. I'm Edwina Welch. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the director of the Cross Cultural Center. And this webinar is the third in a series that we've been thinking about over the summer. We had a Social Justice 101, a Social Justice 201, where Nancy and Izzy had a really good discussion and presentation on allyship and activating allyship. And we thought it would be interesting to begin a conversation about wokeness and what happens when we have a little bit of knowledge and how we can navigate and negotiate that in community.
So we want to start off with the land acknowledgement, or an acknowledgement, I should say. So we want to take this moment to recognize the land and the original people of the Community Nation where UC San Diego campus is located. And although we're not there physically, we still want to give that recognition. And also in recognition of ongoing social injustices and actions that transform our awareness to create structural change.
We want to talk a little bit about community guidelines. Often when we are talking about wokeness or cancel culture or any of these areas, because of what's happening in our world and in our country, these ideas of how we talk about these things that might be a little bit more emotional or might be having people learn differently. We want to make sure that in a remote environment, we have a conversation about what are our guidelines. So one of our first guidelines today is we want to talk about this idea of brave space. And at the Cross Cultural Center, what we talk about is that we can't guarantee a safe space, and often a safe space might be marked by silences and things that people aren't saying, whereas a brave space will allow us to lean into that discomfort, figure out and be more willing to share uncomfortable conversations or questions. And so we are hoping that in our webinar or hour today that we can cultivate a brave space. I will, again, we're going to be talking about pretty large scale topics. In some cases, there might be some things that are triggering. There might be some things that are uncomfortable. I always ask myself specifically, if I'm having some discomfort, what's that about? And let me think through what that is. And I take notes or what other ways we can do about that. The idea is to stay engaged. Very often there's a lot of things that we understand are going on in people's homes or people's attention and their workload. So as best as you can, stay engaged with the program that we're doing today. And share airtime. We're going to be using the chat feature and the Q&A feature. And so please, as things come up, share what those things are. We will be going back and forth in the chat. If you're someone who tends to listen, please share those opinions and get that out there so that can help with our conversation. And then the idea of what we're talking about, particularly in relation to wokeness, is that impact matters more than intention. Sometimes there is ability to be like, oh, that wasn't my intention, I was trying to learn. That's part of that discomfort. And we're going to be talking today and learning and growing together around what are some of the impacts of those intentions. So those are our community guidelines for today, hoping that you all can agree to follow us on this journey.
So some of the things that we'll be going over is kind of what is woke, like the definition of woke, kind of seeing where you all are with your wokeness journey and how what woke means to you. We'll be talking about racial triangulation, performative wokeness, accountability, and how we hold each other, our community, and ourselves accountable, and then sharing some resources with you all. So what is woke? So according to Oxford Dictionary, it's being aware or well-informed in a political or cultural, sense. This definition wasn't officially part of the dictionary until 2017. But the term was actually coined by Harlem Renaissance author William Melvin Kelly in the 60s in his New York Times essay, "If You're Woke, You Dig It." So this definition of, or I guess the popularity of the term didn't come to fruition until 2017 and was officially recognized then. So we're going to go ahead and go into this poll. And the question is, where are you in your woke journey? We'll give it a couple more seconds. Okay, so someone said this is all new to me, it's just getting started, and that's all good. I think that, you know, even if we recognize that we're just getting started trying to be part of this movement and being actionable towards being anti-racist and towards a social change, it's great. Some folks have voted focused more in the action than the process, and then others, majority vote was recognizing this as that the journey is never complete. So true, there is not this like woke glass ceiling that we have, and new things are always coming up, new research, and so we're always growing and learning. So it's great to know that people do recognize this as a journey that's never ending. And then now if you can use the chat feature, we would want to know, what does woke mean to you? Because we all have different perceptions and opinions of what woke or being woke means. So we would like to know from the audience, what does this mean to you?
Someone says culturally aware. Being aware of my own perceptions, biases, behaviors, and constantly working to educate and to learn. Realizing that your lived experiences is not the same as others and working to understand and emphasize what others experience. Do you want to read a few, Beatrice? Would you like me to keep going?
Someone else says, having your eyes open at all the time, a general and or specific awareness of ways our social and political structures affect all individuals. So thank you all for sharing. There's a couple more. Actively participating in learning and activism, being culturally sensitive, being able to digest and open-minded to new resources and learning material, then using that new material to influence and mitigate your perceived notion.
So before we start the video, I want to give a little context and share that we heard about what's happening in Wisconsin, Breonna Taylor and Mr. Aubrey and Mr. Floyd. And this idea that we're going to talk a little bit more about on the back end is, how does wokeness get named and personified? And often I am thinking through how wokeness is related to the trauma in Black communities, and how that trauma gets characterized in what I would say are hashtag slogans and marches and all of the things that actually implicate our struggle with seeing things happen to other humans. And so on the back end, I'll talk a little bit about this, and I will want to give everyone a warning. If you have not seen this video, I invite you to watch the whole thing. We're going to be starting at 11 minutes in, and it talks about how the hashtag Say Her Name began and what are the complications around actual people's lives.
Challenges that are sometimes quite unique. But in the same way that intersectionality raised our awareness to the way that Black women live their lives, it also exposes the tragic circumstances under which African American women die. Police violence against Black women is very real. The level of violence that Black women face is such that it's not surprising that some of them did not survive their encounters with police. Black girls as young as 7, great-grandmothers as old as 95 have been killed by the police. They've been killed in their living rooms, in their bedrooms. They've been killed in their cars. They've been killed on the street. They've been killed in front of their parents, and they've been killed in front of their children. They have been shot to death. They have been stomped to death. They have been suffocated to death. They have been manhandled to death. They have been tasered to death. They've been killed when they've called for help. They've been killed when they were alone, and they've been killed when they were with others. They have been killed shopping while Black, driving while Black, having a mental disability while Black, having a domestic disturbance while Black. They've even been killed being homeless while Black. They've been killed talking on the cell phone, laughing with friends, sitting in a car reported as stolen, and making a U-turn in front of the White House with an infant strapped in the back seat of the car. Why don't we know these stories? Why is it that their lost lives don't generate the same amount of media attention and communal outcry as the lost lives of their fallen brothers? It's time for a change. So what can we do? In 2014, the African American Policy Forum began to demand that we say her name at rallies, at protests, at conferences, at meetings, anywhere and everywhere that state violence against Black bodies is being discussed. But saying her name is not enough. We have to be willing to do more. We have to be willing to bear witness to the often painful realities that we would just rather not confront. The everyday violence and humiliation that many Black women have had to face. Black women across color, age, gender expression, sexuality, and ability. So we have the opportunity right now, bearing in mind that some of the images that I'm about to share with you may be triggering for some, to collectively bear witness to some of this violence.
So every time I see that video, I am struck with what to do with knowledge and power and anger and wanting to be able to be a part of the solution, not part of the problem. A couple of things I want to talk about that I've been seeing go across my Facebook feed is that there's only been 12 days this entire year that there wasn't police violence in our country, that someone wasn't shot by the police. Only 12 days. The other thing I would like to share is there's a wonderful Black feminist anthology, and the title of it is All the Women Are White, All the Blacks Are Men, but Some of Us Are Brave. And it's this idea of, that Beatrice will go into a little bit further in her part, about what our outrage and our wokeness is bringing up for us. I remember having a conversation with one of our faculty about trying to understand abolitionist movements, and the idea that part of the abolitionist movement was the person witnessing the pain, not necessarily seeing the humanity of the people that it is being inflicted upon. And I think Dr. Crenshaw is very specific about this idea of humanness. And I wonder sometimes if hashtags or colored squares or some of our slogans that help us feel better that we are making a difference has some connection to our own witnessing of that pain and having the first reaction being, I need to do something or say something, but maybe not navigating and negotiating the actual humanness of the ways that these things happen. So Crenshaw is very powerful in discussing that behind all of these stories, behind Breonna Taylor, behind the thing that happened in Wisconsin, behind what happens to queer and trans people all the time are these stories. And so how does our wokeness help us understand that humanity or keep us at bay from it? So that's something that I think quite a bit about. And in the next slide, one of the ways that I'm negotiating that is to think about how much all of our activism and our work is related to a particular structure in the United States, as best described, or as in one way described, is about this idea of racial triangulation, that some kinds of acts that happen to people have become not performative so much that they're to be expected. We are shocked when we see the police kill someone. We are, or not shocked. We are living in a society where certain lives matter and certain lives don't. And I did a workshop with Wendy Sasaki a month back where we were talking about how all of our ideas around ableism, sexism, transphobia, classism, immigrant rights are really constructed in the US context of racial triangulation. Who gets to be human, who gets to be seen as human, who is given the benefit of the doubt, and who does not. And we talk a lot about how in our ability to think about what we pay attention to, which communities get attention. My question I think a lot about is why. I was talking to someone earlier today about how often the stories of Black trauma and the replaying of the videos where it's, you're going to be triggered, but we're going to replay this, reminds me of a kind of abolitionist construct where we don't want to see the pain personally, but maybe are we thinking about the families and what's happening to people in those moments? So are people getting their full humanity? And the idea, and we have this in the resource of thinking about racial triangulation, is isms and communities have been pitted against each other. There's this idea of what do we pay attention to and how do we pay attention to that? So as someone who even does diversity work and has done it for years, the struggle of how do we make sure that we are bearing witness, as Dr. Crenshaw said, and also understanding that that bearing witness comes with responsibilities and figuring out the levels of those responsibilities. So I sit with this quite a bit because sometimes the way we know Black lives is through what's happening to Black men, and maybe not queer or trans folks. Or maybe the way that we understand other folks' lives is only through its relation to our own. And how do we work on giving everyone their full humanity? And I think the structure and the triangulation and how we are pitted against each other, or how we are used against each other, or how we even pay attention to each other's communities and histories and struggles really is something I think about within the context of woke culture.
And talking about woke culture, now we're going to talk a little bit about performative wokeness, right? I think that there's this rise of wokeness, and due to social media, it's a lot easier to be seen as a progressive, to share information without really reading what you're sharing. And so performative wokeness really is kind of superficial solidarity. And to me, I think there's been a rise of like woke Olympics of who is more woker, like I'm going to show that I'm more woke than you and I'm superior in my wokeness. But all it really does is kind of feed into an us versus them mentality. I think when we think about activism, we often forget about the collectivism, and what those social movements really had was a coalition, right? And this performative wokeness feeds into this individualism, because I want to be seen as better. I want to be seen as like the progressive liberal or the person that knows the most information, which then dives into cancel culture, right? And so because of the rise of social media, we've seen people get canceled within a matter of like seconds, right? And while I personally believe that some people do deserve to be canceled, especially those that don't take authentic ownership of the harm that they cause or the violence that they're perpetuating. I think that cancel culture does not allow for us to have dialogue nor conversations with one another. It takes away from the community aspect because people are just quickly and oftenly like shut down and canceled and not allowed, to really voice. And then their apology after they're being canceled comes off as insincere and not authentic because since they've been canceled, they feel that they have to provide an apology. And then I wanted to talk a little bit more about transformative justice. Again, transformative justice is a way to reduce harm. It's a framework or approach responding to violence and abuse, and it seeks to respond to that violence and abuse by not creating more violence or abuse and engaging in the harm reduction. So I think that when we are in this performative wokeness kind of structure, we don't allow for transformative justice to happen. We don't allow the person, and when we're in the cancel culture, we don't allow the person who's caused this harm to really transform themselves and grow from it, right? And then some of these examples that I've seen of performative wokeness is large corporations releasing Black Lives Matter statements with no actions, right? So a lot of these large corporations not having Black voices at the CEO table or at the board table, right? Like they're either entry level or they're doing DEI work and then get super burnt out because the organization itself is not really about the actions that they say. And then I know a couple of you probably have seen the Black squares on Instagram. So, posting that Black square, but then having no action tied to it, or just posting that Black square on that day. And then that was it. And then I also want to talk about Pride Month and their product campaigns. And while having these products during Pride Month is great and it's in a form of celebration, we don't know where the money and the profit that's happening from these products is going to, right? So it would be one thing if these corporations are donating to organizations doing work in the LGBTQIA+ community, but yeah, again, they're buying into capitalism and using Pride Month as a way to sell more of their products and market themselves. I did want to ask if you all had any other examples that you've seen either on social media, in your community, in your own personal life, to see what other ways of performative wokeness that you have seen. And I shared this graphic here, or image, that says woker than thou, because I do feel that within the woke and wokeness movement, there's been really this, like I said, wokeness Olympics of trying to prove that I am more woker than my counterpart or someone that's within my community, instead of it being a collective wokeness environment. So if you all could share. Someone said, I have an Asian wife from a white male. Yeah, we've often hear that, or saying like, I'm not racist because I have a Black friend, or things like that.
Gratuitous selfies posted on social media at protests, marches, campaign ads, or news photo ops taken with a token person of color.
Yep, definitely seen that on my feed before. And while I do think that, social media has also helped with the sharing of information and the wealth of, like right now, it's more accessible. We're able to access this wealth of knowledge. There needs to be action tied to the knowledge that we share, right? And I also understand that some people, some people's form of activism might be, sharing the knowledge and sharing the wealth of knowledge, because there's other structural things in place that might not allow them to be at a protest or donate money, different things like that. So there's just definitely a gray area between the two, someone else said. In YouTube and influencer circles with their litany of apology videos after discovering old racist, anti-Black, anti-LGBTQ tweets or social media posts. Yep, definitely seeing that as well. Okay, we'll go on to the next slide.
Can we put this down? We were actually just doing a workshop where we were talking about word fillers, so I just caught myself making one. And this idea, I'm thinking connected to the earlier pieces I was talking about, and that our interns at the Cross Cultural Center talked about a little last year, is this idea of accountability and what's the relationship to accountability. As Beatrice was sharing her constructs about the Black squares and the Black Lives Matters corporate statements, it got me to thinking that part of what I'm thinking through is this idea that sometimes our wokeness or the way we are sharing is through a consumeristic construct. And I think that might be because that's sort of all we have in relation to how we think about humanity and talk about these things. So in the idea of accountability, particularly when people had said things before a while back, they're more educated now, this idea of who gets to hold folks accountable in a wokeness construct, and do we have the ability to hear the critique from somebody, or do we have the ability to share with them, if we can, in a graceful way, that, hey, what you said creates a certain kind of condition. And I know several people probably on this webinar have heard the terms of, how much labor is it going to be for me to hold folks accountable. And I think this idea of transformative justice is, what is our motivation around community building in the collective? And so when we are thinking about accountability and holding people accountable, what is the impetus that comes from in our own constructs? And sometimes it is a righteous anger, and it's a response to anger. And that will get us kind of a back and forth binary construct. And we need to be able to express that anger. So thinking in terms of when we're responding to people and when we're thinking about canceling people, what is it about us in those moments? And just naming that and being honest about it. Sometimes it is anger, and anger is absolutely justified. Sometimes it is, I just need to respond to you and react. And we get into these interesting debates. I try to figure out what's going on with me before I respond, to make sure that I am using my own personal energy and what I'm thinking about. And that's how that works for me personally. It's like the how we do it, even when it may hurt or it may cause discomfort. I think we have worked too long around issues of oppression in this country around comfort and who gets to be comfortable and who doesn't. So I think having honest conversations that require us to name that discomfort and be in it is really important. The also thing is like when to educate and when not to. I think I've talked to people in many years, and every time something comes up, because there's just so much, they're exhausted because you're always trying to respond back to what sometimes might be someone throwing clickbait to try to get that arousal from people and to try to take energy. So I think a lot about this idea of what sort of energy am I using in my personal self, but also how do I navigate and negotiate that? So when to educate and when to cancel. And as Beatrice said, there's sometimes when it's like, I'm gonna cancel you, and maybe you're canceled for 2 weeks because it's taking too much energy, it's taking too much of my mental space. This is what the structural racism and oppression does, is it takes ourselves away from our own joy to respond to a structural need. So really naming those places explicitly about when do I educate, when do I cancel, when do I step back? All of those things are super important. And then this last point about the idea of critical consciousness, which is our own critical consciousness, our understanding of our own energy, our understanding of what our hopes are, or what do we believe by our other humans. People will hear me say very often, oh, that person isn't going to get my energy right now, because it's not going to be a two-way discussion. It's going to be a discussion around you trying to get me to define my humanity or not, and you don't get to ask me what that means. The other idea of critical consciousness, I believe, is around what we are feeding ourselves with. So I know that if I don't watch myself, that Twitter and Facebook and Instagram can make me believe that the world is actually completely on fire. And I would say it's 95% on fire. But there's 5% joy somewhere. So what am I actually choosing, picking, taking to bring those joyous moments in? Whose community am I learning about? Am I saying I'm sorry when I mess up? Am I hearing the feedback people that will give to me? So accountability is like a two-way street. Our own personal accountability, our own power, our own humanity, and the idea of giving that when we can, and when we have energy, graciousness back. So are we trying to do the individual clap back? or are we really working to be building a collectivist construct in this moment where we can use those tools? And those are actual specific, explicit things you can do. I met an influencer once who was very clear about curating their social media and who they highlighted and when they highlighted and how they share. I try to do that with my own. Like, I'm very conscious of, if I read something all the way through, I digest it, and then I make a comment about, oh, this is what this means to me. What about you? So I'm being very conscious of what I'm doing to impact or integrate a kind of idea of a critical consciousness or culture and sharing that knowledge.
I think going back into like when to educate and when to educate and when to cancel, I think for me is like making sure that I know myself and knowing the energy that I have and having those boundaries, right? And so personally, I know that when I know that I'm not going to have an open dialogue with someone and they're not going to be open-minded, we can disagree at the end of the day, right? Still, but if they're still going to be open, then I'm willing to have that conversation, as opposed to someone who's going to keep rebutting me, like still like going completely against what I'm saying and just completely draining my energy. Not necessarily that I would cancel them, but I would set up that boundary with them of saying like, I can't have this conversation with you right now because of X, Y, Z reason. And then maybe by then explaining why I can't have that conversation, they might be open and being like, okay, I apologize. Like, can we have this conversation? Or it might be like, I'm just not going to have that conversation at all. So I think also being aware of our own energies and our own boundaries is super important, to hold ourselves accountable and then to hold others accountable as well. Do you want to go into this?
Yeah, and this gets us to our idea of caring for the self is not self-indulgent, it's self-preservation, and that is an act of political survival. I think throughout this webinar, we've talked about performative culture. We've shown some actual material consequences to what is happening in our world right now. So what is the balance of the energy, as Beatrice was saying? How do I care for myself but not feel guilty about it? How do I stay engaged and collectively be involved in making sure that we are building out a better world for others? And I think that part for me is this idea of the individual versus the collective. We are all an individual in a collective, or we are all individuals in the collective. So what are our stepping up, stepping back? What are our ideas of caring for the self? And knowing that that is a political act as well. We don't have to respond to something that everyone says. We don't have to always be the one to step up and make those moments. And at the same time, when we have cared for ourselves, when we have the energy, when we have the power, I think it's incumbent upon folks with knowledge to share that knowledge. And so that navigating back and forth of that wokeness and those pieces are very important.
Now we want to kind of talk about leaning into self, and ask you all, what is one thing you will do to hold yourself accountable and others in your community accountable? What would you do? What are you willing to do to lean into your discomfort, and make sure that your wokeness or your woke journey is including everyone and being inclusive? So we'll go ahead and do that to the chat. So again, what is one thing you will do, and how would you hold yourself and others in your community accountable? So be intentional about everything I do and seek and learn to protect my energy. Make sure to fully engage and digest, honestly try to understand in spite of whatever feelings that come up, and encourage others to do the same. including, sorry, this moved way too fast.
Challenging close friends and family on their rhetoric when it disenfranchises or harms certain groups of people. In turn, I will remind them to keep me accountable for my speech and not to be afraid to call me out.
Take some time to reflect, pause on my own actions, reactions, resume conducive conversations, hold others accountable by asking clarifying questions. Then challenge racism and sexism when I hear it, but also try to do so with grace rather than anger in hopes that we will be more effective.
And recently I've been in a lot of conversations with family members who have been saying everything from misinformation as a result of ignorance or not knowing how to research to outright racism, etc. It's been a balance to know my own boundaries and what I can influence.
Yep, and I totally resonate with that last comment. I think it does get difficult to hold family members accountable, especially because they're your family, but it definitely starts at the home and knowing the boundaries that you have, right? Like how the person mentioned of when do you step back from your family because maybe they're being toxic or not listening to what you're saying. But at least for me personally, it's like at least I said my piece, and whether they agree with it or not, they know the information that I was able to share. Then someone else said, be intentional and equity-minded in practices and programs, policies, and interactions along with curriculum.
Yeah, and Beatrice, that last comment, I was sharing with somebody the other night that people don't necessarily have to agree with you, but they can't unhear what you said.
Yep. I find that I'm asking more, so what are we going to do about it, and think about how to affect change and encourage others to do that in ways we can see, not just learning.
Yeah, as a book nerd, I'm very excited about all the anti-racism books and the learning, and I'm hoping that as part of performative wokeness, people aren't stopping there, where they'll have a lot of knowledge and intellectual pieces, which I love to read, but then they're like, well, I'm done. I now know that history of that group, or I know that the history of this oppression, and that's all I need to do. I'm not challenged to spread that outside of myself. So I have all of the books on most of those lists, and the reading is only the first step in a step of 10.
And someone said, they don't have to agree with you. Someone loved your comment of they don't have to agree with you, but they can't unhear what you said. These are just a list of resources. Once the video is uploaded, we'll make sure to upload also the PDF link to this PowerPoint in case you all want to reference it or reference the resources that we have shared today. Anything else that you want to add, Edwina?
Yeah, I think at this point we wanted to leave enough time to be in community conversation, set up a general context. We have time for community conversation, questions, things that you might be struggling with. Between Beatrice and I, we would love to be in community conversation. So we don't want to fill the whole hour with content, but really wanted to have a chance to hear what questions people have, what are people struggling with, so we can all learn and be in community together. So if you have any thoughts or questions.
I would also like for you to take the survey to help us kind of get feedback and then also know more about what workshops you'd want to see, what more information you'd want to get from us, so we can all still be in this community of gaining knowledge and more access to knowledge.
Yeah, specifically around that, we are looking for themes for the fall equity for staff by staff workshop. So along with any comments, or ideas or questions, if you're like, I really want to have a conversation with other people about, drop that in the chat as well, and we'll take that as we're doing our planning for the fall. I'm moving the little chat box around so I can make sure I see everybody's face and the questions. Someone said, thank you, they really needed the conversation, supporting these conversations. Anybody struggling with the news is like, we're gonna show you this. It's triggering, but we're gonna continue to show it to you every single time, which is a thing I'm personally struggling with now, that we have to show these injustices. And is that helping desensitize, or is that supporting woke culture? I don't have a good answer for that. But the re-traumatization of it is starting to weigh a little heavily.
And I think it's tying a little bit into trauma porn or resharing trauma porn.
Which I need to learn more about. I've been feeling that this week specifically, though. It's like, okay, I've seen this 5 times on all the news shows.
Yep, someone said can't watch those type of videos. Totally agree.
And then if they don't share it, will people not think it's true? So I really want to have a conversation about differences within progressives, similar to what we're seeing with JKR and anti-trans. It's been tough to talk with mostly white women about the way their anti-trans sentiments are discriminatory. Well, one of my questions about that, and then there's only been 12 days with no police shootings in the country. It's wild. Is I even worry for myself that a little bit of knowledge can be a dangerous thing, because it might stop us from being self-reflective about the ways in which we are marginalizing other groups, or doing that same, all the women were white, all the men were black, but some of us were brave. So there is a concern around, well, I know about anti-blackness, and that's where my focus is going to be, as it should be, but that focus also not making me be aware of all these other things that are intersecting. So Black people are trans people, queer, have disabilities, but other groups also have that same intersection of identities. And what I'm thinking through is how, and Beatrice and I were talking about this, like foregrounding and backgrounding. Like, we never want to take away from anti-racism and anti-blackness in a construct because it's so embedded in this country. And that embeddedness in this country is deep and pervasive. At the same time, all of those other things are embedded and deep and oppressive: xenophobia, transphobia. And what happens is, in this capitalistic binary construct, we think we can only do one thing at a time. So I think it would be incumbent upon me to say what I'm actually saying. Wendy and I have that conversation a lot, because if you don't put a context in, I'm talking about Blackness right now. That doesn't mean I'm keeping everyone out, but I have to let you know that I know enough about that, that you know that's happening for true. Like that I'm not doing something to the exclusive of something else, but I'm holding all of them and having a particular conversation at this moment.
Someone said, I worry about cancel culture overreach over something very old or maybe forgivable, leading to a backlash against criticizing people who may warrant that criticism. Yeah, I agree. Like there is an overreach sometimes. And I do think that, I think if you become an influencer, you should probably go back to the stuff that you had and watch the things that you say, and probably release an apology before people dig up your old tweets or your old posts, right? Because then we are taking self-accountability, right? And not having other people dig up this stuff, and now it's not looking authentic because people dig stuff up, and then you have to release a statement because you're an influencer, but is it really authentic? And I think it could be authentic if your actions going forward show the authenticity. But yeah, cancel culture is definitely a big thing due to the rise of social media and just technology in general.
And then someone in the chat says, how do we address people who say I'm on this diversity committee and use that to deflect criticism? How do we prevent those memberships from granting people a sense of institutional power? I've been thinking a lot about that, particularly in light of our 21-day challenge, and there is institutional work that often happens. My question is always, how self-reflective is that person about how they show up in a room? And how self-reflective is that person about their own positionality and privileges, whatever those may be. They might be gender, they might be class. And so if it's only that I'm on this thing externally, it's kind of can be woke culture, meaning I'm doing this because it makes me feel good, which is a plus. That doesn't absolve you or any of us from our complicity in structural racism, sexism, and homophobia. So the question becomes, where's the intrinsic reasons of why? And sometimes people only know to start with, I'll get on a committee, because they haven't studied their own positionality. They don't believe they have any, like they're witnessing all of these terrible things happening and they want those terrible things to stop so they can stop witnessing them. Not what am I doing to contribute to that, even in my silence. And so having those nuanced conversations with people about, what are you reading? What are you doing? What are you involved with? Because in our culture of capitalism, the first thing you do is do what we call transactional check the box culture. I feel terrible, I'm gonna join a committee. I feel terrible, I'm gonna read a book. I feel terrible, this shouldn't happen. That's all true, but that doesn't change the structure. That's just my abolitionist viewing that this makes me feel terrible, so I want to change it. That doesn't grant humanity to the people that it's happening to. And so it's gonna take a little bit of deep work to really ask ourselves, are we seeing people as humans or as hashtags? Are we seeing people as slogans? So sometimes I think our trauma can become a slogan, and that, what are we doing then to change the structural images of that? And we feel good about that. Like I am really happy that there are 26 billboards up for Breonna Taylor. I think there should be 26 billboards up for Breonna Taylor. And I would give money to that. And that's a piece of it. But what else am I doing about Black women's humanity and what's happening to Black women in violence and Black police? So it's just going that other, not just, it's going that other step to be like, I can be outraged by something and that's a part of my wokeness, but that doesn't grant the humanity to those people and their full lives and that full history and that full telling.
And the second part to that was like, how do we prevent those memberships from granting people a sense of institutional power? Kind of tough.
Because that's what the institution rewards that.
Mm-hmm. And there needs to just be a continuous of accountability. Like even if this person gets a set, or whoever it may be gets a sense of institutional power, right? How do we as a collective and as people who work for such institution hold that person accountable, right, in their actions? Like Howard Wino was saying, like asking them, well, what are you doing in this diversity committee? Like, what are you doing in this committee to really go be anti-racist and try to break down structural racism or institutional racism that's happening, right? So I think it is tough to have these, like, ask those difficult questions and conversations, but I think it's also necessary.
And I think the more we can create the conditions where those questions become the norm and people don't fall back into the emotion of how dare you believe I'm not, I don't care, that we make that collective learning together. And it's part of being uncomfortable when someone even comes to me and says, that looked performative, Edwina, what about X? And the first thing that's gonna happen is I'm probably gonna have an emotional response because that's not who I believe myself to be. And then how do I slow down and say, what is this person trying to tell me? And how do we build that kind of culture of accountability in our offices and with our friends and our families? Because we don't actually have that. What happens is there's usually some tears or somebody feels bad and then they give an excuse. And then it's like, we can't work with this person because we can't say anything because there's power. And then we're in that vicious cycle where sort of white supremacist culture stays because we haven't learned how to talk to each other through these difficulties, or even hear that we might not be as woke as we think we are.
Right, and I feel like there's no growth without discomfort. And even if we think we're like the most liberal, progressive person, there's still going to be something that we might do wrong. And it really is about taking that accountability, right? And being self-aware. I think self-awareness is probably key to all of our woke journey.
And as we're waiting for another question, we really wanted to do a 301 conversation, because what we had been seeing is we were staying in the how to just tell people or make in an awareness construct that, oh, you should be aware that these things are operating. But for folks like us who are like, no, we're working in this and we really would like to see structural change, sometimes we can get in our own way when we're talking to the unenlightened or the people that we want to cancel, because we're woke and we're liberal and we have some knowledge, and that can create even more barriers because we might have an even harder time listening. We have about 6 minutes or so left, which is an hour in Zoom time. Would love to hear any more thought, what you're sitting with, what you're gonna take from this and go do. One of my goals is with Zoom silences is to figure out a way to play music.
Do you want to give it one more minute? And if not, we'll go ahead and end the webinar. And again, please make sure if you can fill out our survey, we would greatly appreciate it, to learn more about just feedback, get feedback, and then also learn more about what you all would want to see in our upcoming staff equity talks.
Yeah, and we got some good advice, a spa portable speaker next to your laptop. I will be trying that. Love the link to the TED Talk. If you just put in intersectionality Crenshaw, you'll get the whole thing. I think it's about 23 minutes total.
I can also just email it to all participants as well. I'll email the PDF version of the PowerPoint and then also share the link to the video. And someone said, I loved your idea of a how to respond to webinar for common conversations with family, etc.
We might want a Zoom meeting for that one. We can all be around a table.
Yeah, a virtual table to have these family conversations that are difficult to have sometimes.
It's been great to continue with the 301, 302. Staff Association has a new functional chair position with an EDI focus. Please let me know how we can assist with these talks. Definitely we'll be following up for sure. And welcome to that new role. I love it.
All right, do we want to end it there?
Yeah, so thank you all for coming today. As Beatrice was mentioning, we were recording this, so it will be made available on YouTube on the Cross Cultural Center's channel. Shameless plug for our channel. There's wonderful tour of the center. Our interns have been doing amazing things in spring quarter, and a lot of their workshops are recorded in there, also with closed captioning. Be looking for our flyer for fall equity talks as those are in development. And thanks again for being a part, and I'll let Beatrice have the last word.
Yeah, and I'll make sure to send that email out with the video link, the PDF version of this PowerPoint, and then I'll also share our social media channels, how to follow us and get more information as to what we're up to and how you can share with, if you work with students or your department colleagues. So thank you all again.
Thank you. Have a good rest of your day and take care.